what we're trying to do at this moment is, yes, we hope to reduce the conflict in the group and those kinds of things. But because of the complex dynamics that center around conflict, really what we're trying to do most of the time when doing conflict resolution is purely providing strategies of how to reduce conflict. Okay. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when we talk about that topic today. But what I would like to start with for today is a topic we left off on Thursday and we went through, but I want to make just a few more points about it. Last week we mentioned the issue of immediacy, and I made the analogy to the buzzword of the seems the this almost decade now of now I can't remember the buzzword, mindfulness, okay, and bringing a person back to the current moment and the current place, okay. I want to differentiate the difference between the use of immediacy in the therapeutic setting and the use of mindfulness in the therapeutic setting. Okay. As I mentioned last week, immediacy and even mindfulness are used when a client is starting to go through, for example, working through trauma, and they're starting to trigger to that trauma. So they're having a trauma response to it. In the addiction setting, it's when either they are having traumatic response to things they did while through the addictive process, but also when, and this is very common in the addiction setting, when they start to go through the addictive cycle. And it usually starts with things like glorifying the use of alcohol or drugs, talking about how good it used to make them feel. It's about telling the stories that um, start to develop addiction into this thing that is something missed. It's something I wish I could bring back, and those kinds of things. And that's the start of what we call the addictive cycle spiral. Okay, is minimizing the use by emphasizing the things that positively happened while in the addictive cycle. So, when do you use what we call immediacy and when do you use mindfulness? Okay. Mindfulness is a skill that you want to teach your clients when they are having a traumatic response. Okay. So it is a skill where you're trying to bring the client centered back into themselves and back into the moment. And there's several mindful techniques. There's the breathing technique. There's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm trying to remember what they are. Uh, what you see presently, something you hear presently, something you feel presently, something you smell presently, taste, and what anything you taste in the moment. And what that is bringing you physiologically and in doing so psychologically back here into the moment and into the time. The breathing is counting the breath, breathing in, feeling the air, feel their lungs, having them count. Other ones is there's a visualization task where they focus on a picture of some type, usually an abstract picture, and when they notice their thoughts thinking about what they're going to have for lunch or dinner, they purposely bring themselves back to the image, or when they start thinking about past experiences, they bring themselves back to the image. A lot of meditative techniques are a form of mindfulness. That is when you're developing a skill that your client can use to bring themselves back centered, calm, deal with conflict here right now and not go back into those trauma or addictive cycles that they've been in the past. Okay. Immediacy is when you're bringing the client back into the therapeutic setting. It's when you notice that your clients are having difficulty processing something. It's when you notice that clients are starting to have a trauma response. It's when you notice that um, it in, tension in the group when we're talking is increasing. Okay. And this is a feed off of what we talked about with emotional intelligence. Okay. Remember, emotional intelligence is understanding how I feel and then understanding how the people around me feel and then how to negotiate that space. Immediacy is when a counselor notices that the tension is rising in the group or in the therapeutic setting, and they say something like, geez, when you tell me that, that makes me feel this way. I had an emotional response to what you're telling me. And what I'd like you to do is reflect on, if I'm feeling this, you must be too, or you might be feeling something different. What are you feeling right here, right now, by telling us about this story or about this event? Or I notice that you have a very, uh, you're becoming, you don't want to say you're becoming, you want to say, I notice there's a lot of feelings in your face and in your body. What are you experiencing right now? Because I'm experiencing it. Okay. Now, the thing you want to keep in mind is the mistake counselors often do when using immediacy is they tend to make it about themselves. So they'll say something like, man, that was an awful experience. It brought back, a lot to me too. And I feel how you're feeling. And I've experienced that too when I've got into the situation like this. This is what I did. Okay. Now I want you to think of the mistakes that are being made in that moment. Okay. One, the counseling session is no longer about the client, it's about the therapist and what they're experiencing. It's not reflecting emotions back to the client and seeing where how they're doing in the condition they're in. And then two, the disclosure part. When you personally disclose, when I went through that, this is what I did. I want you to think about, in most people who have experienced addiction, experienced trauma, they often have had family, friends, all when they tell them stories like this, I'll say, well, stop right here. I'll give you the solution because that's what I would do in that situation. And if you just did this, you would be fine. Okay. I want you to think about that message you just sent. This is not anymore a situation where you can experience something. This is where you're just going to get advice like you've had in the past. And so that's going to close down the client. That's going to make them feel that they're not being listened to and that it's about the therapist. It's not about me anymore. Okay. Now, the question is when should you use personal disclosure? Okay. Personal disclosure is helpful in the relationship building period of the therapeutic process. So it's very helpful within the first 2 or 3 sessions. Beyond that, personal disclosure and how you've handled yourself in the past really has no basis in the therapeutic process. So in the beginning, when you're trying to make a connection with your client and they say, I've been, for example, with addiction, I've been an alcoholic for so many years, the client says, and this is where if you are a therapist who have gone through that, this is where you can go, I went through addiction too, and it is a struggle and it is hard to overcome those, but it is possible. Okay. Notice what the therapist is saying there. They're making a connection with the client and kind of probably the doubts they have in their mind. They're probably thinking about how many times they've been in that seat before. They've thought about how many times they've tried to stop before but couldn't. And what you're saying in that moment is saying, "Hey, I get you. I understand your doubts." And then providing that moment of hope. Okay. That's an appropriate use of personal disclosure. Okay. When personal disclosure becomes wrong is when the counselor starts to give advice based on their personal experience. All right. And that's a very, very dangerous thing for therapists to do because one, they've got advice their entire life, and therefore they're just going to assume that you're just there to tell them what to do, and that's going to give them a key justification to relapse, to fall into the addictive process, to manage trauma responses and not work through them. Okay. Um, and so keep these things in mind. Now, it's also helpful in personal disclosure if you are a therapist who is working with addiction and trauma to say, I've never went through addiction myself. Um, but I do know what it's like to live without drugs and alcohol. And I'm going to tell you that it is a good life. Okay. What you're doing is saying, you know what? I'm here to help. I'm here to focus on you, and I need to focus on you, but also understand my perspective on this is that I want you to know what it's like to live sober and drug free. Now, in that though, and this is again where people who have not experienced what their clients have experienced is you want to make sure that you in your mind have formulated the way you're going to explain your personal experience, because the difficult part for people who have never experienced addiction or trauma or something like that and then they facilitate groups is the issue of judgment. So you want to be very careful in the way that you uh, give your personal disclosure, that it doesn't sound like, okay, all right, they've never dealt with addiction. They're just going to sit here, they're going to judge me because of what I went through, and that kind of response. So in a way you have to do a little bit more work. Okay. With that being said, research has clearly shown that the effectiveness of a counselor based on their past experience has little to do with the outcome. So an addiction counselor who has went through addiction, at least based on research, is no better addiction counselor than an addiction counselor who has not gone through addiction. As long as they're kind of, I'm going to use the word mindful about, if you have not gone through what your clients have gone through, that you do not express your personal experience in a judgmental way. Okay. So I wanted to come back to this because, again, immediacy is a skill that is meant to bring individuals back into the therapeutic discussion. It's meant to bring them back here and talk about the experience that they're having right there in the moment and helping them work through it. Mindfulness is a skill that you're teaching so that when they are not in the therapeutic setting, they have a skill to bring themselves back into the moment, back into the situation. Okay. So I wanted to come back to immediacy and explain that a little bit more um, before we moved on to our next topic, which is conflict resolution. Okay. And again, I'm going to say that this is probably, if you're going to become a family therapist, a couples therapist, counselor, social worker, a group therapist, definitely needs to know these skills because it because in each of these settings, conflict is something that tended to be something that hasn't been managed well in a lot of people who are in the group settings life. Okay. And when we're talking about different types of groups, people with an addiction have probably had conflicts with family, friends, the legal system, and haven't and may not have the skills to really work through those conflicts. People who have dealt with trauma, a lot of people do not understand what are known as trauma responses. So when someone acts overly emotional and or I should say behave because it's not an act. When they have a negative response to something or it and people tend to take that personally and then can create conflict through that. Okay. So the point of really conflict resolution within the therapeutic setting is really helping your clients develop the skills to handle conflict outside the therapeutic setting. Okay. So let's talk about that. What is conflict resolution? Okay. And this is the basic definition. It's a way of two or more parties to find a peaceful solution to a disagreement. Now you'll notice in this definition that it says peaceful solution. Okay. It doesn't mean that both parties will come into a single agreement about the conflict. What it means is a peaceful solution is that each side understands how where the other side is coming from, and so the solution to the problem should be understanding to both parties' understanding of what happened. Okay. So let's go through this. So, why should we resolve conflicts? To come to an agreement that benefits all parties, to understand more about whose ideas, beliefs, and backgrounds may be different from your own, to ensure that your relationships with opponents continue to grow instead of divide, and to find a peaceful solution to a difficult situation. Okay. Again, in conflict resolution, it's not about changing minds, it's about understanding perspectives and then coming to a common ground that may not be 100% satisfactory to both parties, but is something that is beneficial as a group or as a couple. Examples, for example, in couples therapy, and the like. So, the steps to conflict resolution is first to understand the conflict, and then to communicate opposition, and then brainstorm possible resolutions. And then at this point, if the two cannot come up with a solution, this is where you explore an impartial mediator, someone who you both can talk to that can then mediate a decision. Okay. And then, of course, explore alternatives, use coping skills to deal with the stress and pressure. And I'll get to that one in a minute. and then choose the best resolution. Okay, so the first part, as far as a facilitator, is to understand the conflict and communicate with the opposition. And this is where I do like to use when police officers come up to a traffic wreck or a domestic violence calling. Okay. The first thing that you will notice is what the police officer does is separate the parties. Okay. So, in a lot of domestic violence situations, the officer will go back we'll use husband and wife for this conversation. They'll take the husband to maybe one room and the wife to another. And then each officer will interview and whatnot to get the perspective of each of the individuals. And then usually what happens is the officers come together, they talk with each other, and then make a decision. Okay. The separation part is kind of where that coming back and making a decision is kind of where that is different from what we'll be doing versus what they do in the legal system. Because what the officer should be doing is talking about the story and then making a legal determination based on the story. Okay, that's not what we're going to do. But the thing we should do is, yes, separate the individuals that are having conflict, interview both parties, and then go through this. Now, why is it important to separate the parties? Okay. Well, even when, for example, in the domestic violence situation, even when they just kind of partially separate the two in the room, but they still have visual or nonverbal contact with each other, that can bias perspectives. It can make the victim start to deny what happened and say, oh, it wasn't that bad. Because why? Because that offender is right there. They're looking at them, they're giving nonverbal cues about if you say something that gets me in trouble, you're going to be in trouble. And so it's important when you're dealing with especially extreme conflict to make sure that when you separate them, they're separated not only within hearing distance, but within visual distance. Okay. Now, the second part that is similar to what a police officer does is once you understand both sides using all of the skills that we've been talking about, you communicate with each party kind of what they said and come to a common story. Okay. And then that's when you bring the two back together and you have them then work through the resolution about what's been said, what's been doing. And this is where you are in at essence at kind of acting as kind of the use of an impartial mediator, where you're there, still there. You've told each other, expressed each other's stories with each other, and now let's talk about some solutions. Okay. Now sometimes this is where the conflict ends because the two came back together. They heard what you communicated and what you heard, and they're like, geez, I didn't know I was expressing that way, or I didn't understand that was your perspective, those kinds of things, and they come up with a resolution. Other times, because of maybe the uh, divisiveness of it, sometimes you as a therapist have to act as the mediator, where you say, well, it looks like you guys are not coming to a solution. So let's explore some alternatives. Since we can't come to an agreement, what are some alternatives? Okay. And in this is when you want to cope with stressful situations. So when they start getting frustrated and angry, this is where you want to use relaxation techniques, separation techniques, all of those things. And then in the end, what you hope is that we just choose the right resolution. Okay. Now, this is what you would do kind of in a formal group setting, or if you were working with a couple or family and those kinds of things. How does this translate then into skills that they can use? Okay. Commonly, when people first enter into, for example, therapy, conflict resolution is one of the first skills that a therapist tries to teach their clients. Okay. And so, what they usually will do and recommend is when you two get in a fight, what do they ask? Separate this part, and get some separation from each other and cope with your physiological stress response. Okay. So they'll talk to again, we'll use husband and wife. They'll say, husband, what do you do when you feel physically tense? And they might say, oh, I go to the garage and work on something. And the wife says, no, I go for a jog. And then you say, okay, when you start to get angry with each other, separate. You go to the garage, you go for a walk or a run, and for about 10, 15 minutes, and then come back together. Okay. And talk it through again. But the idea is that you want them to calm down their system, think about what they're really feeling and experiencing, and then come back and then brainstorm solutions to the problem. And then, of course, in some couples situation, they will say, well, there's that game show that was on a while back. I want to be a millionaire or whatnot. And they say, all right, if you need help with this question, you can call someone, you can, um, communicate with someone else that might know the answer, right? And so in these situations, in a lot of common counseling, they say, okay, who could you call that could help you resolve this situation? Um, and so they pick a few people and they talk to those individuals. And so that's that impartial mediator when a couple can't come to a solution. Who can they get in touch with that can help them resolve that situation? Okay. In group settings, it usually is, if you think of AA groups, right? That's your sponsor. In other types of relapse prevention programs, it's everyone kind of exchanges numbers and says, okay, if I get into a conflict, I'm going to get in touch with you, and those kinds of things. So that's kind of the idea. The issue that I would express when dealing with conflict is that often what muddies the water of conflict is our stress and emotion response. Because our stress and emotion response wants us to fight or it wants us to run. Okay. And those are physiological events. Those are things that are physically happening in the body. So, the most kind of important skill of conflict resolution are all of these other skills we've been talking about: using a mindfulness technique, using immediacy, using silence, using reflection, using paraphrasing, using attending and listening. All of those are skills that help bring down that physiological response to allow the individual to kind of open up their mind and be more receptive to information that their opposition is trying to relay to them. Okay. So, again, in the conflict resolution, there may not be a resolution, but you can at least bring them to an understanding that we have a difference. But the important thing about conflict resolution in the group setting is you're teaching a skill, not just resolving an issue between two or more group members. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop my sharing because